Hey guys, today I wanted to talk about transitions within StarCraft, and I think obviously, once again, this is something that can be applied in all sorts of areas in real life and in all sorts of games. But I'm going to use, of course, StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2 as kind of the examples for it. So yeah, let's talk about transitions. Transitions, well, first off, here, let's put down what is a transition, right? Transition is changing what you are doing. Very simple, right? So, for instance, if you are playing StarCraft 1 and you're Zerg and you're going Mutalisks for a long time and then you want to switch into Lurkers, we would call that a transition. Okay? Now, a transition, this is the weakest part of your game. Just by definition, switching what you are doing, what you are creating, is going to be your very weak point. It's a great way to think about this, I think, is think about the human body, right? Okay, so look at your arm. Where does the top part of your arm transition? At your elbow. And then it transitions into here, right? And where does this part of your arm, your forearm, transition? At your wrist, right? These are the turns. These are the changes that are being made. And those are the places where you're most likely to become injured, right? Those are your weak points, your joints. This is a good way to think about transitions because you're kind of changing direction. The same would be like your knee from your hip to your calf, right? That would be a transition in your leg. But this is such an important concept, I think, that a lot of people screw up and they get confused as to why they're losing, because you're trying to transition into maybe the thing that counters what your opponent is doing. Okay, let me actually play a little video clip here from this was a cast that I watched about a year and a half ago that two of our smartest people in StarCraft were having together, Day 9 and Rotterdam. And they actually had a little exchange that I remember when I was watching this, I was like, oh, damn, that was just put so succinctly. This is such a great example that I actually just saved the link in my notes. And when I was thinking about doing this video, it kind of came to mind as a great example. This little tiny thing that these guys talk about within this game. So this is just a Terran versus Protoss between New Thermal, the great Dutch Terran from Europe, and Zest, the GSL champion. Okay, so let's go ahead and listen to what they have to say here.
Warp's in one right now, but I think there's a good chance that the first big fight will take place way before +1 armor is done, and Zealots without +1 armor are not that fantastic, and I'm actually shocked to see he didn't even start charge yet. It's just...
All right, so see what Roddy just said there, right? It's like the what he should be going for is charge and +1 armor for his Zealots against the Bioforces of Euthermal. Okay, so I mean that's right, because that's going to be kind of the thing if you're going gateway style. That's going to be a better counter against the Bioforce. Now look at what Day 9 says in response to that.
Pure Blink Stalkers at this point.
Yeah, I mean, when you are up against a wall, doing transitional moves can always be quite scary. So just continuing to make Blink Stalkers, which are just the absolute juiciest, cleanest defense you have at this point in the game.
All right, so I think that explains it really, really well. Sorry, screwed up with that click. But so Roddy is talking about what is the next counter, and he was almost kind of surprised that he was consistently making Blink Stalkers here, even though they might not be as good, right? And then Day 9 mentions oh, if you feel like you're up against the wall, sometimes just continuing to produce what you're producing is the right way to do it, right? So let me give some other examples that we can see within StarCraft games, right? So probably the biggest transitional move that we've ever had in StarCraft at all, StarCraft 1 or 2, was probably the era where we had mech switches from bio switches in Terran versus Zerg. And I think this is probably the best example that you can really get, right? People might remember this a few years ago, around 2018. it was very trendy to open up with Marines and medics and some science vessels and then switch into mech against Zerg. Now, that transition involved lifting off all your barracks in your base and putting factories there. So you literally have this period of time where you lift off your barracks, and it's going to be about 1 minute where you're not producing basically any units because you're adding factories, which take about 50 seconds to make, and then you're producing units again. So that's a very obvious transition where you are going to be very weak right there, right? So I think that's a pretty good example. Like I mentioned before, if you're going Mutalisks and you switch, you transition into lurkers, that's going to be the weakest part of your game, right? When those hydras are being made, you're no longer making Mutalisks, you're making lurkers. You have this period in there where you're very prone to an attack, and that can be very scary. And well, there's countless things like this. A lot of times it's like a more mobile army transitioning into a stronger army, like a more tanky, a higher damage output type of army. But you do have to be very careful in those situations. And sometimes it's actually better. And this is one of the reasons why StarCraft is such a great game, is because, yeah, you have these things that counter, but they don't counter so hard. Like, you've seen games, I'm sure, where someone is trying to switch into something that counters what their opponent is doing. In fact, I'm sure you've played games like this. And they don't get enough of it in time. Like, let's say you're playing StarCraft 2 and someone's trying to switch and go into Immortals, and then the Roaches come, they have one Immortal, and it just isn't enough. Yeah, but if you had 10 of, like, whatever else it was, instead of adding all your production and going into that so quickly, then you might have done a bit better there. So staying on a certain type of unit to prevent the transition, it's kind of like how comfortable you're feeling in that time. Can you buy time while you're doing your transition? This is such a key factor, and it's not by necessarily attacking, right? I mean, these games are so broad and there's so many circumstances. I can only kind of speak in some general terms here. But these are things that you want to think about. Like, when you're transitioning, the worst thing that you could ever do is lose your army. Now, what are some great things to do, though? Pretend you're going to attack, right? Run up and, like, act like you're hitting a base and run off in some other direction. A move like that can be fantastic. Maybe that keeps your opponent on the defensive. Maybe that makes them think, oh, he's still going to produce like a lot of mutas or something like that. But if you commit, if you start losing some of your units because they're starting to get countered, which is why you want to do the transition, then you're not going to have those units to buy yourself time to add support to that transition, because again, right when you're transitioning, this is going to be the moment where you don't have enough of your new thing. Like, let's say Terran StarCraft 1, right? You've opened up with vultures, and your opponent is getting into units that counter vultures really strongly. Like, let's say they're starting to make a bunch of dragoons, right? Well, you are going to need to get into siege tanks. So the worst thing you can do is go lose those vultures, because suddenly there's no threat of counterattack. The dragoons can go straight across, and they have 10 dragoons. You have 2 tanks that just popped out. You're dead, right? But if you're kind of running around with the vultures, let's say that you only have like 2 vultures and your opponent is starting to think about coming out. Maybe you need to make 2 more vultures or 4 more vultures so that you can really threaten those counterattacks. You can run in, show them, back out, right? This is going to actually buy you more time, even though you're not spending that time making the actual counter. That type of play is going to make it a little bit more difficult for your opponent to take advantage of your transition. Okay, well, yeah, there's a lot of varying degrees of this idea, and I hope that this made some sense for you. But yeah, I think it's an important thing for anyone to really think about when to do this, how to do this cleanly, because that's a big thing. If you can get through your transitions really cleanly without your opponent taking advantage of those, you're ahead. And of course, when you get ahead, get further ahead. Okay, guys, thank you for watching.